Welcome to the Oley Foundation webinar, Notes from a Plumber's Helper, Clogs I Have Known. My name is Rosalind Dahl. I am the Communications and Development Director for the Oley Foundation. I think everyone is probably familiar with the Oley Foundation, but just in case this is your first experience, I'd like to briefly introduce by Dr. Lynn Howard and her patient Clarence Oley. Today we serve approximately 17,000 members. All of our programs are free of charge for patients and their families. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Mark Klang. Dr. Klang is a research pharmacy corps manager at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City and has been active in specialized nutrition support issues all of his career. He works in a lab and has devoted much of his time to studying the issues of drug administration through feeding tubes and clogs. He is active in the American Society for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition and many other professional organizations. He has been published in several scientific publications, including the Journal of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, the International Journal of Pharmaceutical Compounding, and the Journal of American Medical Association Dermatology. He has presented at Oley conferences, contributed to the Tube Feeding Troubleshooting Guide, written for the Lifeline Letter, and advises Oley staff and members about drug administration issues related to tube feeding. We're very grateful for the expertise he so generously shares with the Oley community. Thank you for presenting today, Dr. Klang. And now, Dr. Klang, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Okay. All right. Show my screen, bring up my slides, and bring that over here, minimize this. All right. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about clogs and the issues and the studies that I've done about feeding tube clogs. I'm going to go over the nature of the beast, some of the sticky messes, things that make slow moving, and why doesn't it dissolve? It's a bitsy pieces, funs with chemistry, part of my fun. Food for thought, more about fizzies and things that vibrate, and my favorite, rinse and rinse again. So the nature of the beast. Well, it turns out that when you're looking at a clog, it's pretty much, from my perspective, an intact protein reacting with a low pH. Anything something acidic, things like lime juice or something like that. If you mix that in with a protein product, you actually get a gel, almost like a jelly kind of product. That gel will stick to the sides of the walls of the tubes, and that's what forms most of the clogs we've seen. Elemental diets and peptide-based diets don't react with the acid, and so therefore sometimes those patients find better tolerated. Undissolved solid is the other end of it, is that when you look at drugs that are not crushed properly, if you look at powdered nutrition products, you really got to stir these things up very thoroughly. Different fiber mixtures, etc. Also, blenderized tube feeding. There's a lot of people like to use the blenderized tube feeding, but you got to look at it and really break that up to very, very small pieces. What causes the clogs? Again, in my perspective, it's inadequate fluid. The more fluid you put with it, the better things dissolve. Remember, in order to ensure something to be absorbed, it needs to be in solution. In order to improve its delivery, both nutrients and drugs, it's always better to add a little extra water. And a lot of times, it's multiple insults coming together. I've seen situations where drugs that do interact only will form a clog in the proper settings. So let's say where it's tube designs is another issue, where the tubes, the internal diameters of the tubes can actually cause clogs. Looking at how the distal site is formed on these tubes, more openings on the end of the tube, you get more clogs, and also kinks. Now, I worked on a project with Eric Frankel in Carol Rollins, and they are really the experts on this stuff. They already got hands-on with this, and we did a module together for Aspen. And in that Aspen module, they identified that checking the residuals was one of the big key complaints of where clogs were formed. Slow rate of administration was another area. Medication interactions, inadequate flushing, and again, tube design. Also, the Aspen module suggested that there was increased yeast. Some patients actually get mold growing into the tubes. In that case, you really want to remove the tube. You don't want to have support that. Polyurethane, it turned out polyurethane tubes are better than silicone tubes if you have an increased issue like that. Antacids and also this product called carafate or sucrafate, they also form clogs. They form what they call bezoar. But most of the people I've seen is that where bezoars occur, they more occur in the esophagus, not so much the feeding tube. But this is an area for clogs to occur. Now, checking residuals. This is a standard for many of the nursing protocols. You want to see whether or not the stomach is emptying. You want to know that you're not overfeeding the patient, putting too much in the stomach. But one of the problems is that if you do it, if you check for that function by checking residuals, that is pulling up the stomach contents through a tube and measuring it, what will happen is that different people who do that same procedure will actually have different measurements. There's been a number of reports showing that really checking residuals is an inaccurate measure. If you really want to check to see whether or not the stomach is moving, take a stethoscope and listen for the movement into the bowel. Doing residuals also causes aspirations and erodes the interior of the tubes. It's something to be avoided. Check the latest Aspen guidance. I had a chance to contribute to this, the safe practices for enteral nutrition. There's a lot of good items that are mentioned in there. Formulation issues. Now, when you look at certain drugs, not all drugs are formulated the same way, and a lot of times drugs are put in special types of formulation that lead to clogs. Now, an extended release drug should never be given through a feeding tube, not just running the risk of a toxic effect because the drug will then release the entire amount that which should be over an extended period in a very short period of time. There have been some cases where people really got very sick from that. But also extended release have matrices on them that form clogs. Many formulations use a wax like polyethylene glycol that actually forms a wax around the drug to allow the drug to release slowly. If you try to crush up a wax matrix, you can actually wind up even with a much higher dose than it actually appears on the label. We studied that here. We found that slow mag, it's a slow release magnesium, actually contains a whole lot more magnesium in the product than appears on the label. But when we take that slow mag and leave it intact and measure how much gets released, it appears that that is what's on the label, and it does go. Now, PPIs are proton pump inhibitors. Also, they're basically used in order to reduce the amount of acidity. And the lab next door to me is being dismantled, and you can hear the vibration of the machines through the wall. That's how that has come through. The slower release of PPIs are because they have a coating on each of the pellets. If you remove the pellet, you can actually make the drug immediate release. Things you don't want to put through the feeding tube in terms of drugs, potassium tablets. They actually, if you put them in a liquid form, you'll find that the tablets will actually form plates and they don't dissolve very well. Clarithromycin, that was from Eric Frankel, came up with this one. He found that the suspension pellets are actually like little logs, forming log jams, especially around bends in the feeding tubes. You'll also take a look at some of the generic products for phenytoin and vancomycin capsules. When you open up the capsule, you get a plunk. It's a solid tablet inside. They don't dissolve very well. Ciprofloxacin suspension should never be used in a feeding tube because of the beads also will clog. Now, a lot of people still like to use fiber, and Metamucil is one of the agents I'm not too happy with. But there are many different versions of Metamucil, and look at stuff that is fast dissolving. If you have a fast dissolving fiber, that is sometimes better for the feeding tube. Other products where like Consul, it's a heavy duty psyllium fiber, I would advise avoiding that because it does clog the tube. Sugar-coated shells. A number of drugs have a sugar-coated beads or etc. like that. When you have those types of beads, you need to get it through the feeding tube. So let's say Flomax or tamsulosin. That drug has a lot of tiny beads, and many men, prostate issues need to take this medication. The only way you can get this through is mix it with a little bit of apple juice. Apple juice is acidic, and it keeps the beads from clinging to one another, and therefore you're able to get it through a feeding tube. I would recommend using a feeding tube that's greater than a 16 French in this setting. They're probably smaller than that. It starts to get clumpy. There was a study that was done with 8 French, but I think it was 2 out of 3 of the tubes got clogged. There was also an interesting drug, Emend, apropent, which I have a hard time pronouncing. The apropent is a drug where the drug is actually sprayed onto sugar granules in order to enhance its delivery. If you take this drug and you mix it in a cup, you will actually separate the sugar from the drug, and then the drug will just fall to the bottom of the cup. My advice in that type of setting is, for those types of drugs that are formulated that way, put the drug inside of a syringe and use that syringe to make a slurry, and then give that intact mixture through the feeding tube. It's a much better way to deliver that kind of drug. Sugar also makes the medicine go down. Yes, Mary Poppins. One of the things is that sugar helps to dissolve because it has an acidic pH. Having an acidic pH, it allows that most of our drugs are weak bases, so that it helps them dissolve better. But on the other hand, it adds to a higher osmolarity, and if you give this to patients who are sensitive to it, maybe especially in the lower GI tract, like in the jejunal, you will get diarrhea and cramping. It adds to the viscosity and the thickening of solution, and it keeps drugs suspended more evenly. But I advise the pharmacists who do compounding, use something else other than sugar. It's far safer. Now, take for example here, many pharmacists compound products, and they tell me that they compound it with OraSuite, Oral Plus. This stuff contains a high sorbitol. Also, it contains parabens, which a number of patients tell me they have allergies to. I recommend, there's another type of suspending agent also available in most pharmacies called Searspan. Has a much lower osmolarity. Or another thing, if you want to do it on your own, I've done it for some studies, is make up a solution of 0.5% carboxymethylcellulose. And we found that really works well. It has no flavoring. And of course, with a feeding tube, you don't need sweeteners. You don't need flavoring. So you don't need to have that type of thing. The problem with the carboxymethylcellulose is it takes about a day to dissolve it. So you got to have it made in advance. Now, the thing I'm showing you here, this table, this is a table of a study I did a while back, looking at osmolarity, pH, and the compatibility of select medication. There's a lot more drugs than are just on this report that Nicole Eng did for us. But she pointed out that usually when a drug is acidic, it will be incompatible. But that's not always the case. As you can see here, for azithromycin and ketosustrel, the formulation plays a big role in whether or not it's going to be compatible or incompatible with enteral nutrition. So yes, acidic liquids, is pointed out by an old study by Cutie and Altman, acidic liquids do form clogs very easily, but also keep in mind that a number of other drugs also will form a clog. This is a long time ago study, 1995. This is a group of nurses got together and what things form clogs. And what's interesting is carafate. And back in those days, this carafate, sucrafate, was only available in tablets. And what's really funny, Lillian Harvey, she shot a slide that shows the carafate. I think it was the AR that's on the carafate. She found it in the feeding tube, but the AR is still visible. So hopefully she can get us a picture of that someday. Potassium chloride tablets, as I mentioned earlier. Also, back in those days, the Theophylline tablets were used a lot, and those really should be cautious about breaking those up because they were many times were extended release. Fiber, clogs, phenytoin tablets. A lot of people switch to phenytoin tablets because there's been a lot of concerns that the phenytoin suspension has interaction with enteral nutrition. There's been no reports on the phenytoin tablet having that effect. Enteric-coated medications probably should never have been gone through a feeding tube, and hence that's why they clogged. Avoiding the clogs by rinsing. Now, some people, best chances are rinsing with water. Now, there are some reports that say pancreatic enzyme. Some reports say use sodas. I call it Mountain Dew is one of the things suggested. Cranberry juice was suggested. The thing is that some of those sodas and stuff, they're sticky. Also, they're acidic. So if you put these anywhere near an enteral formula, osmolite, stuff like that, they will form a clog. Feeding tubes also degrade with a lot of the above. You keep rinsing them with those acids, they do break down. Polyurethane tubes are very susceptible to strong acids. They're also susceptible to alcohol. Nobody should be putting pure alcohol through their feeding tube. At least not with polyurethane. Nothing is superior to water. In all the studies that I've played with, all the different tests, etc., we always found that water, and sometimes we just warm up the water a little bit, and we got it to go through the clogs, and we're able to restore flow. And again, juices, sodas are acidic and make clogs work. Now, right now, we're doing a big project here. I've got a group of students coming from LIU. They're crushing up medications. They select 10 medications, and each drug is examined for how well it dissolves. And we try to mimic the same sort of situation that occurs on the nursing station. We also look at the osmolarity of the product, and we want to see whether or not the undissolved powder will get trapped on a screen. Well, what we found is that pretty much all the drugs we tested left some sort of residue on the screen. All the drugs have some sort of cellulose, some sort of insoluble excipients in them. So you can never fully dissolve a solid tablet. What you can do is add enough water to it so that it's able to pass through the feeding tube. But we did find out quite a bit at 100 microns. That's pretty large particles. But you can give some insoluble substances provided you mix it well and rinse it well. So take a look at this. Oh my gosh, this one really clogged up the screen. But what we found was interesting is that this was the 10 milligram size. When we used the 5 milligram size, we were able to get it to go through the screen. So a lot of times it's selecting the right dosage. Take, for example, a cyclovir 200 milligrams dissolves better than, say, the 600 or the 800 milligram size. So the larger the tablets have a lot more excipients added and add to clogs. This drug here, I can't even pronounce it over there, but as you can see, it even clogged inside the syringe. In these settings, we were mixing chemotherapy. I think this one is tamsulosin. This one also had a tendency to clog. What we did in this setting, we took the capsules and we didn't open them. We just put the capsules directly in the syringe. That formed quite a bit of clogs. And the reason we were doing that is because we didn't want to expose people to the chemotherapy. And there's new rules coming out from the USP 800 that advises that if you're going to be mixing these kind of drugs, you need to be wearing something of a mask, an N95 mask, not one of these things, the little things that have the yellow masks that have the loops around the ear. Those don't protect you from breathing in the chemotherapy. You got to get a mask that's certified to fit your face, and that's an N95. In these settings, I always tell people to add the drug to a syringe and dissolve it in water. But when you have a capsule, it takes a long time to dissolve. What we're looking into here is whether or not the injection can be given through the tube. We found that is the case for topicide, otherwise known as VP16, or cyclophosphamide. That also can go through the feeding tube. Now, PPIs I mentioned earlier, proton pump inhibitors. These are like lansoprazole, that's Prevacid or Nexium. These products are excellent for the feeding tube. And many patients are getting these types of drugs for feeding tube administration. Stay away from the tablet forms. The tablet forms do not dissolve very well. If most of the drugs, you open the capsule, you mix it with apple juice, and you rinse well, and give liquid 30 mLs before and after. A number of places mix the capsule with sodium bicarbonate. Now that erodes off the entire coating and exposes the drug to the acid environment, but you're using a drug that's used to reduce stomach acid. So generally, that's a good product for both gastric administration and into the lower GI tract, like into the jejunum. Orally disintegrating tablets, they're excellent for this type for feeding tube. They can be mixed with as little as 5 to 15 ml, but I've seen patients get away with as little as 5 cc's, and they're excellent to administer into a gastric feeding tube. Now, do not use an orally disintegrating tablet for under the tongue. Although that is a way of administering it to a person who has a functioning GI tract, the problem is you need to have an intact GI tract. If you have an obstruction, the product won't get to the site where it's going to get released. You can mix it with apple juice. But PPIs are also one of the most common drugs reported to clog. And there's actually papers where they gave the drug with water, but they didn't recognize that the water was actually causing the bees to get more sticky, and that clogged up the feeding tube. So try to avoid using that. Now, slow movers, avoid administration less than 50 mLs per hour into the gastric environment. When you pump in anything through a tube, you'll notice that there's a movement for the tube, and you can see that in the center of the tube there's actually a higher rate of movement than along the edges. The velocity on the edges is slower, and therefore it allows for a retrograde clog along the feeding tube. So therefore you can actually get a clog forming if you're giving slower than 50 mLs per hour. It causes a reaction with the migrating acid that goes back up along the wall. Now, why don't the drugs dissolve? Some drugs don't dissolve readily when they actually combine with nutrition. My advice, don't ever do that. There's some studies that show how ciprofloxacin, ofloxacin, levofloxacin, all those had reactions. What the study did is they took the drug and they stuck it right in the enteral formula. Do not do that. You don't mix the drugs with the formula because that's where you form clogs. One of the best ways of improving dissolution, reduce the particle size. I always tell people, you throw a rock into a lake, does it dissolve? They say, no, actually it does if we crush it up. If we can make it smaller, the rock will dissolve someday, but not while we're alive. But if we make the particles smaller, it increases the surface area, and therefore anything pretty much can dissolve. So that's one of the ways we do improve our delivery. Suspensions are very thick. You got to add water to them and thin them out in order to get them to go through the tube. Another thing to think about, is some people have tried surfactants to improve dissolution. I advise you to stay away from that because you can get into trouble with things like mineral oils like that. They get absorbed more rapidly in that setting. Actually, they get absorbed, and you don't want mineral oil absorbed. It's a bits and pieces. That's it. Get it down to a very small particle. The smaller the particle, the increased surface area. Adding more fluids also reduces clogs. And again, most drugs contain cellulose, and it never dissolves. It actually thickens in an acid environment. There's actually some reports that maybe that's what's occurring with phenytoin suspension, why it has such an interaction. It has a thick amount of cellulose mixed as a suspending agent, and it reacts with the stomach acid and the enteral nutrition, and that's why it clogs, and also doesn't get absorbed. This is a nasty clog, and it's, oh, there's my little note about Dr. Harvey. She saw the pink remnants inside the feeding tube. That's not her tube. Also, the dimensions of the tube. Now, 10 French is pretty much the minimum for solid drug administration. The ideal is 16 French. And most of the studies, when they studied drugs going through the feeding tube, use a 16 French. 8 French only can accommodate commercial liquid formulas. Blenderized diets are really not going to make it through an 8 French tube. Avoid red rubber catheters. Some people still cling to that stuff. We're going to eliminate them here. They clog easy. They have cracking, etc. Foley catheters. I understand some people like to use that as a backup in case their tube goes. Consider that they contain latex. They have no material coating, and they have a tip that actually leads to more clogging. So remember that it's only a temporary connection. Also, avoid anything that has a lower fitting. Lower fitting is one of the reasons why we're getting into using the enfit, is because some people use feeding tubes that contain lower fittings, and they actually, somebody took the mistake and connected their enteral product to the ID line. Now, I show you the little inset on the bottom there, the far right there, shows you the stylet channel. That one on top is the Sherwood feeding tube, and we stopped using them here because the nutritional channel was actually much smaller. So even though we had the same external diameter tube, the dot hole on the bottom there worked out a lot better going through the tube. Size is important. 20 French clogs less, and what we found in our studies here for our medical staff and our GI service, they try to put in a 20 French tubes whenever we put in pegs. we find much less complications associated with that. Tube design, the distal port, as I mentioned earlier, the more exit points on the distal end of the feeding tube will lead to more forms of clogs. That's why the Foleys don't work out too well. They have too many exit points, and so therefore they clog. Now, we all have heard about the enfit. The enfit is going to be put into place. Remember that the enfit actually was started with a website. It was called Stay Connected 2014. It's moving ahead, and I understand now in 2017 we will actually see it implemented. It's something that's not just with us in this country in the FDA. It's actually a worldwide movement. So it's something that's going to happen. We need to make people aware of it, and then see what we can do in order to improve the care using this type of device. Now, the internal diameter of the enfit is actually a little bit smaller, and it's a standard size. So it is the enfit opening is 2.95 millimeters. Even with very large tubes, there is a reduced flow, and so our GI service is using 20 French, so it's going to be, even in that setting, they will find a bit of a restriction. So it's pretty much the enfit opening is standardized. Some companies are looking into seeing what they can do in order to improve flow, even though they have that restrictive opening. And I'll be meeting with the people at BD later next month and see what we can do in order to improve the flow in that type of setting. There's been some reports about inaccuracies with the enfit syringes, and this is pretty much what shut down BD. BD is Benedictson, and they make the majority of syringes out there. They found that when they were making syringes that fit the enfit device, they actually found out an increased incidence of inaccurate dosing. So they're going to be adjusting for that. And I understand there are now new adapters attached to the syringes that enable you to give more accurate dosings. Now, there's these cases where the inaccuracy of the dosing was occurring was mostly with very small amounts of drugs and in doses that were meant for very small infants with drugs that were very toxic. I believe one of the drugs that were tested was digoxin liquid. In that setting, we need to improve the delivery. I would recommend we dilute the drug in that setting in order to improve its delivery. Now, fun with chemistry. As I mentioned here, the acid products enhance the delivery, but in this jejunum, the area is more basic, and so drugs that are a weak base and being administered into the jejunum need to be dissolved first in order to enable it to be absorbed. So you can add it with acidic liquid, and that way you can allow it to be delivered into the lower GI tract. So when we get into the post GI tract, we have a number of people are liking, a number of our prescribers like to use the lower GI tract because there's less aspiration risk. But the problem is that those tubes are generally smaller than gastric and also more prone to clogging. We're monitoring that situation here at Sloan Kettering. We found that there's an increasing number of PEG as the patients tolerate feeding directly into the jejunum. The problem is that the drug absorption is completely different in this setting. And like I said, they need acid to dissolve. So many times we mix an acidic juice or mix it with water beforehand in order to deliver drugs in the jejunum. Also, because of the smaller feeding tubes, it's better that the drug is already in a liquid form when you're administering it. Solids will clog in the jejunum, and they will have not any opportunity to dissolve because in the jejunum there's less residual fluid. Food for thought. Insect proteins, as I mentioned before, react with acids to form clogs. Fats also congeal, but if you have a congealed fat, you can dissolve it with ethanol. Fat will react with any salt. If you mix it with sodium or potassium, it forms a soap. If you react oils with calcium or magnesium, they actually form grease, and grease does not dissolve very well. If you get grease type of clog, you really need ethanol in order to dissolve it. Remember that ethanol is a lubricant. I use it at parties. Anyway, it also dissolves lipids and soaps and polyurethane tubes, so we have to be careful around using that. elemental diets, individual amino acids. They require mixing. Unfortunately, they stink. And actually, NASA developed the first elemental diet, and they used it up, and the guys with the right stuff smelt an elemental diet and said, nope. Anyway, supplements are often powders, and they require extensive mixing in order to avoid clogs. Formulations, you got to review the intro formula and its preparation. Check with the directions. Intact protein for clogs with S, as I mentioned earlier. But if you improperly mix a powdered formula, that also forms a clog. Use a blender or something in order to get those things going. Blenderized foods also cause clogs, but you got to check to see whether or not the foods are appropriate for feeding tube administration. This type of preparation is discouraged because there's a lot of complications associated with clogging your tube. Many patients I know like to use the blenderized method, but you've got to use the right type of blender. I'm not the expert on the selection of the blenders in there, but I have seen that when they put the product, the blenderized diet, through a cheesecloth, some people have been able to administer very effective diets in that setting, and they were able to pass the product through an enfit feeding tube. So keep in mind, I think your Oley Foundation is a great resource for that. My advice, though, leave out the walnuts and raisins. If somebody's adding that to their oatmeal, that definitely formed a clog. Fizzies. I mentioned earlier, sodas. There's a lot of papers suggesting that carbonation will be helpful. It does not assist in the breakup. All these carbonated products are acidic, and they're great to dissolve the drugs, but they will make a protein-based clog worse. They've all got a pH about 3 to 4. Beet tenderizer, MSG, papain, all have been reported to use in feeding tube. They have very little success. The best remedy that's in all the papers is warm water. Dissolves everything eventually. The biggest issue is getting the agent to the site of the clog. If you have a clog further down the tube, it's very difficult to get it down there. Probably the best methods is to get some sort of introducer to that, and we'll get into that later. Pancreatic enzymes have been shown the best documentation. Marquardt did great studies on this, showing that pancreatic enzymes were able to actually break up the clogs. But the problem is that the majority of pancreatic enzymes are enteric-coated. I was just reviewing ASHP. Many pharmacies have gone with using, because of the numerous amount of pancreatic enzymes out there on the market, picking only a select one on their formulate. All the ones that they've picked were enteric coated, and in the feeding tube, this is not a good idea. You got to remove the enteric coating, mix it with sodium bicarbonate, and in our study, we needed even a little heat up 37 degrees, and it took about 30 minutes in order to get this stuff to dissolve. VioCase is the only FDA-approved agent for this use to actually be administered through the feeding tube. Remember, you always need bicarb with these products in order to activate the enzyme. If you use these pancreatic enzymes, you got to keep in mind that it may make the clog worse if the clog is not formed by a protein clog. It actually has a certain, it has some sort of inserted item inside the tablet, and it doesn't dissolve very well. So you do not use it unless you're sure it is a nutrition-based clog. Now here's another interesting device, a company called TubeClear. You can find them on the web. It's tubeclear.com. They have a soft probe. It's a stylet that goes into the feeding tube and actually acts as a little jackhammer, and the internal portion of the tube goes thump, 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 thump on a very, very rapid basis, and it has an introducer that taps on the clog, and it actually vibrates and loosens up the clog. I've seen some demonstrations of it. It looks very interesting, and it really looks good for very long feeding tubes. In the shorter tubes, we recommend using the brushes, but you got to be careful with the brushes. There's a chance of causing puncturing the tube, and you never, ever, ever want to put the stylet back down into the tube, because that may also put a hole not only in the tube but into the patient. We like to avoid doing that. There's another products out there, Clog Zapper and Declogger. Clog Zapper has a special introducer to get the enzymes to the side of the clog. A lot of people have told me they have a lot of success with that. It's up to the individual. It's whether or not what forms a clog. What's nice about the tube clear device is that it will break up the clog, whether it's a drug or whether it's a nutrition product. So it works on everything. Rinse and rinse again. The best remedy to avoid a clog formation. Dissolve all medications with ample amounts of water. Try to avoid lumps in the food, even the blenderized products. Get one of those bullet blenders or whatever. Make sure you get no more lumps in the food, and that way you can improve the delivery. My recommendation always is to have a liquid form of the drug. But if it's a very thick liquid, you got to dilute it. I always recommend when you have thick liquids, 3 times the volume. Never administer sustained release or pressure sustained release drug for a feeding tube, and always mix the tablets, hard Jejunal capsules, with about 10 to 15 mLs of water. I like to think that most clogs are drugs, at least the ones that I bump into. Let me know your experiences. Do not add the drugs to a container or the formula. If you're on a continuous tube feeding, stop the tube feeding, flush the tube with 10, 15, 30 mLs of water. I like to administer each dose separately and flush between doses. Also flush the tube after you give your last dose. And that's it. Let me turn on the slide, see if we connect to Robin, and we're on. I'm going to turn me off.
Okay, that was great, Mark. Thank you.
All right. You ready for the questions, or how do you want to do that?
Yep, we are ready for the questions. So, several questions were submitted with the registration that can be answered with resources on the Oley Foundation's website. Here are the main pages people involved with tube feeding will be interested in. There's the main tube feeding page, which gets you to all things tube feeding on the Oley website. Specifically how-to and troubleshooting advice you'll find on that next link. Some people are interested in tips on skincare, blenderized diet, socializing, even weaning from tube feeding. We've got a lot of resources like that on that tips page. And finally, you might want to check out the helpful products page. There's some interesting things that are small but might make a big difference in your quality of life. I also want to mention that the enfit syringe designs are evolving, and to get the newest information on getting the correct medication dosage through an enfit syringe, you can find that information at gedsa.org, that's GEDSA.org, or at the Oley website, oley.org, in the January-February 2017 newsletter. Some of the questions that were submitted online as part of the registration process were, are GJ tubes more prone to clogging, and do you have any specific advice for this type of tube, Dr. Klein?
The GJ tube allows you to have an access point in from the stomach that goes and it gets tunneled into the jejunum. In this type of setting, the tubes are generally smaller and also have more of a bend to them than a tube that goes directly into the jejunum. In this setting, it may be more prone to clogging because it has a bend and because it's a small bore feeding tube. Other than that, there's no real restrictions. This is to be used in a patient where they would have trouble accessing the jejunum directly from outside the skin. And so in that setting, it's ideal for those particular patients, but it is something that may be prone to more clog.
Okay, we have another tube-specific question here. I have a McKee. How do you get clogs out of the extension tube?
In that setting, I would recommend using a stylet. Those extension tubes, the ones that I've seen are generally shorter, and that there's a number of stylets that are available. Check with your suppliers. I believe Oley has a number of suppliers that are available, and take a look at that because the various different stylets are able to unclog those extension tubes. But also get an idea of what is causing the clog. Generally, if you rinse that tube well before and after, there's no reason it should be clogging. So keep an eye on the rinsing.
Got it. Okay, and this is another tube-specific or type of tube-specific question. What factors do you find contribute most to the clog of NG feeding tubes? This person, oh, I'm sorry. This person finds that the winter room temperature seems to cause a problem.
I haven't seen that particular situation, but winter room temperatures do bring up the idea you see more static electricity issues. And in that setting, I wonder if there were powders involved and that the powders did not dissolve thoroughly. But I have not seen the temperature playing a role in that other than the static electricity issue. Also, NG tubes are notorious for having lots of bends in them, and they, in that setting, they do have a tendency to clog more.
Right. Do you have a list of commonly used medications that come in liquid form?
No, but that paper that we did with Nicole Eng that was in the Enteral Nutrition did itemize all the liquid medication that we currently have on formula. But not all liquids are really appropriate for the feeding tube route. It really requires a careful evaluation. All liquid medications are pretty much designed for pediatric use. And in that setting, it's being just for the improve the taste. Kids have very fussy taste. And so when you're trying to administer those products, they're very, very sweet. A lot of times you don't need that type of heavy sweetness or flavoring agents or any of the other products added to it. And sometimes a compounded liquid formulation, as little as taking the tablets and crushing up and mixing in water, is a better product for a feeding tube patient than using a commercially available liquid.
Right, and you had written an article for the Oley Foundation that addresses just that point that people can find on the Oley webpage. That's a great tip there. The next question, someone has written in, I've heard that if you follow the directions, Metamucil does not clog the tube. Do you agree with that?
Everything depends on the formulation of the Metamucil. Metamucil, there's so many different varieties out there, flavored ones, orange flavored ones, I don't know. And there's some that are fast dissolving. My favorite product is Benefiber. Benefiber I've not seen clog the feeding tube. Some of the more raw forms of Metamucil definitely will clog. And one of the ways you want to determine it, do yourself a little experiment. Take the Metamucil, mix it in a clear glass, and when you mix it up, stir it up, and then pour the product out. Do you see a lot of residuals sitting on the side there? That residual is going to lead to a clog. If you have a product that dissolves well and goes well into the solution, you should have no problem putting it through a feeding tube. But do that little experiment yourself and see whether or not that's going to work for you.
That's great practical advice there. The next question, when I am bolus feeding, why will my tube feeding stop or clog when I cough and sneeze?
My thinking would be that that's from your diaphragm. Your diaphragm, when it comes up when you cough and sneeze, causes a jerk reaction that squeezes down on the GI tract and therefore would also shut off the flow through there. I like to avoid giving feedings to a person that's coughing or even sneezing. You like to make sure that your GI tract is intact and that there's no disturbances along the way. I hate to see anybody aspirate the contents up the GI tract towards the lung. So if you feel you're going to cough and sneeze, hold off on the feeding. Okay, be safe.
Okay. And then, Dr. Klang, how do you know when to pursue a clog versus getting an X-ray of your abdomen? You know, when the feeding's not going through.
Gee. I think part of it is that if you're unable to restore the flow using water, my advice is go in and have it checked out because you don't want to damage the tube and you don't want to damage yourself. So in that setting, I always use the warm water, give it a couple of tries. I give it three tries, and after that, I give up because I don't want to damage the tube. And that's really crucial, one of the most crucial issues. You're unable to restore the flow with like 3 tries with these standard formulas of warm water. In that setting, I would go call up somebody and ask for help.
Okay. Then the last question is, should you pause your feeds for a period of time following a medication administration?
Well, that's a controversial area. There's a number of reports. The Aspen guidelines came out and said that they wanted you to pause 30 minutes between it. Frankly, from what studies we found, is that if you take the drugs and you administer a sufficient amount of water in order to deliver them and give it a good rinse before and after, we found no interference with the drug, with the enteral nutrition products, because the enteral nutrition products are usually given in a slow way afterwards. If you're giving a bolus feeding before and after, then I would hold off on giving the feeding immediately after. So a lot depends on how you're administering the product. If you're giving enteral products over a continuous basis, I see no interference with the interaction with the drugs, and I've seen that in a number of studies. But if you're doing bolus feedings, I would wait and give it about 30 minutes, and that should be fine.
Okay, the next thing I want to mention is that I advise people who are interested in this topic to watch the supplemental question and answer recording that is available on the Oley website for information on enfit connectors and how they may affect tube clogs. We have an expert from the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Manpreet Mundi, addressing that issue specifically. It's a separate recording, but worth your time to check that out. So thank you so much, Dr. Klang, for an excellent presentation. As I mentioned before, we so appreciate you sharing your expertise. I want to thank Shire for supporting this important educational program, and I want to thank the participants for joining us. Look for a recording of the presentation on the Oley website, and Dr. Klang has also made the presentation slides available there as well. We hope that you'll join us for another webinar down the road. Our next scheduled presentation will be held March 7th on coping skills, tools to help you live more fully. For more details or to register, visit the Oley website at www.oley.org. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.